How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 16 of Masechta Shevuos. Friends, so friends, what are we doing? What are we doing? Okay, yeah. Okay, we are doing like more stuff about like how to be like Makdish, like parts of Yerushalayim and stuff. That's kind of interesting. I think Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita v'Kitchel Asud Lavo, or not. And also about some like the Tumah becoming tummy and the Azara stuff. So really exciting stuff on today's daf. Okay, Tazayin Amid Aleph. I'm in a little bit of a time crunch. I want to make it to Mincha in like 45 minutes. That means that hopefully this daf won't be more than, let's say, 40 minutes. So hopefully we'll see. Okay. Says the Gemara, Kol shaloi naisis b'chol elu chulei. So the Mishnah had said in the Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis, right? The Mishnah had said that when you bring Makdish Yerushalayim with the Azoris, so you need the king, the prophet, the Lachmei Todas, all sorts of things, right? And it says there, v'chol shelo nazis b'chol elu. And if you don't have all of these details, if you go into there when you're tamei, you're not going to be chayiv, you're going to be potter, because if you didn't have all these things, it's not actually part of the temple. Okay. So now it says the Gemara and Daf Tes Zayin Amid Aleph, the second line of the Amid. Itmar Rav Huna Amar. Rav Huna says Bechol Elu Tanan. Rav Nachman Amar Be'achas Mikol Elu Tanan. So a machloikes Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Rav Huna says, as our Mishnah says, Bechol Elu, that in order to be Makdish, Yerushalayim, the Azaris, you need all of these things. You need the Urim V'Tumim, the Melech, the Navi, also everything listed in the Mishnah you need. Rav Nachman says one is enough. Even one of those things is enough. Even just having one of those things is enough. Again, Itmar Rav Huna, Amar says Rav Huna, Bechol Elu Tanan. The Mishnah says you need all of these things. Rav Nachman Amar Ba'achas Mikol Elu Tanan. Rav Nachman disagrees and says no, even just one of them is enough to be Makdish Yerushalayim, the Azoris. Rav Huna Amar B'chol Elu Tanan Kasor v'Kedusha Rishoyna Kitchel Shaita v'Kitchel Asid Lavoi Vezer Zeicher B'Amud Avad. Rav Nachman Amar Ba'achas Mikol Elu Tanan Kasor v'Kedusha Rishoyna Kitchel Shaita v'Loi Kitchel Asid Lavoi Ve'ezer v'Kedusha Kodesh Havgav Lohayu Urim V'Tumim. Chevra, Ezra and Nehemiah, when they came back to Eretz Yisrael, when Ezra and Nehemiah came back from Eretz Yisrael, they were in an exile, and they came back, the Yidden, they came back to Eretz Yisrael, and they built the Beis HaMikdash. Hopefully, we will see Mashiach today, and we will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash in Eretz Yisrael. Akoponim. Ezra and Nehemiah, they came back to Eretz Yisrael, and they were Makdish Yerushalayim. Right. They did the ceremony to be Makdish. I think it was Yerushalayim. What does it say? It sounds like Jerusalem. So now here's the thing. In the Bayis Sheni, they didn't have the Urim V'Tumim. So clearly, at the ceremony, they were unable to do all of the things. They're unable to do all of the things. So the shaila is, if they're unable to do all of the things, then what did they accomplish? So this is the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Rav Huna says that in order to be Makdish the walls of to be Makdish Yerushalayim, you need all of the things, which means Memele, Ezra and Nehemiah weren't actually accomplishing anything, but not to worry, because Kedusha Rishoyna Kitchel Shaita v'Kitchel Asud Lavoi, according to Rav Huna, that the initial Kedusha of Yerushalayim never left, and it remained. And therefore, even though in order to be Makdish Yerushalayim, you need all the things, and Ezra and Nehemiah didn't have all the things, but they didn't need all the things because the initial Kedusha was still there. What did Ezra and Nehemiah do? They did a ceremony, but it's not what was Makdish Yerushalayim, it was already Kadosh. Whereas Rav Nachman says, all you need is even one of the things. And that's enough. And Ezra and Nehemiah were actually being Makdish Yerushalayim because it says Rav Nachman, Kedusha Shana Kitchel Shaita V'loi Kitchel Asad Lavoi. Because the initial Kedusha of Yerushalayim went away when we were exiled. And therefore it needed to be restored. And Ezra and Nehemiah were restoring it, and even though they didn't have the Urim V'Tumim, even though they didn't have a Melech, it nonetheless was sufficient. So again, starting over. Itmar Rav Huna Amar says Rav Huna B'chol Elu Tanan. Says Rav Huna, you need all of these things. Rav Nachman Amar Ba'achas Mikol Elu Tanan. Rav Nachman says even one of these things listed in our Mishnah is enough. Rav Huna Amar B'chol Elu Tanan. Rav Huna says you need all of these things. Kasover he holds Kedusha Rishon Kitchel Shadav Kitchel Asad Lavoi. Rav Huna holds that the initial Kedusha of Yerushalayim never went anywhere, and it remained. And therefore, even though Ezra and Nehemiah didn't have all of these things, they didn't have an Urim V'Tumim, for example, not a problem because the initial Kedusha was still there. The Ezra Zecher B'Amahu, and Ezra was just, he was doing the ceremony, but it wasn't actually crucial for, it wasn't actually crucial, it wasn't actually being Makdish. Yerushalayim was already Kadosh. Rav Nachman Amar Ba'achas Mikol Elu Tanan. Rav Nachman disagrees and says even one of these things is sufficient. Because that Rav Nachman holds that the initial Kedusha of Yerushalayim was temporary, but that it went away when the Yidden were exiled. The Ezra Kadusha Kadosh. And Ezra, when he came back, he was Makdish Yerushalayim all over again. Urim V'Tumim, and even though the Urim V'Tumim were not there, it was okay. Eisvei Rav Nachman. Rav asked Akasha to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, I don't understand how you could say that only one, all you need is even just one of the things listed in the Mishnah. Kol shelo naises b'chol elu. It says in our Mishnah that you need kol elu, you need all of the things. I don't understand Rav Nachman. You could say it's talking about one of the things. Tani ba'achas mikol elu. Rav Nachman says no problem. What it should say is achas mikol elu. Learn achas mikol elu. That if you don't have one of these things, well then it's not Kadosh. But as long as you have one of them, it is Kadosh. Tashma coming here. Abba Shaul Omer says, Abba Shaul, Shnei Bitzin Ayu, Baramishche, there were two marshes on the Mount of Olives. There were two marshes on Har HaZeisim. My aunt is buried on Har HaZeisim. She's got an incredible kever. She's got an incredible kever. It's a good place to be for a while. Although hopefully Tchiyas HaMesim is going to happen very, 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 very quickly. But very soon. I'm telling you, my aunt's kever, that's like, she must have had connections. I think she gave a lot of tzedakah to somebody, I don't know, whatever. I'm telling you, you'd be jealous of this kever. It's like mamish, at her funeral, it was like a year ago, a little bit more. Yeah, at her funeral, like we mamish got there, I don't even know how the Chevra Kadisha got there. It was like literally, the funeral was like in Kiryat Belz, in Shamgar. It ended probably like 10 minutes before Shkia. She was buried before Shkia in Har HaZeisim. I don't get it. But, I don't know, the whole thing is crazy. But anyways, like the sun was setting over Har Abayis, and that's where she was buried. She's like mamish, like, she's like right opposite Har Abayis. Akoponim. How did I get into this? So there were two marshes on Har HaZeisim, where my aunt is buried. So Abba Shaul Omer, Shnei Bitzin Ayu B'Har HaMishcha. There were two marshes on Har HaMishcha, on Har HaZeisim. Tachtona v'Alyona, a lower marsh and an upper marsh. Tachtona niskacha b'chol elu. So the lower marsh was niskadeshed with all of these things. Elyona lo niskadeshed b'cholelu, but the upper marsh did not have all of these things. Ela ba'ole gola shaloi b'melech v'shalo b'urim v'tumim. Rather, Ezra, when he came and they added on to the city, and they built a wall around it, they added the wall to encompass. Does that work? To include this upper marsh, but of course they didn't have a king. They didn't have Urim v'Tumim. Tachtona shayisik dushasa gemuda, and therefore the lower marsh, which had all of the things, because it was from the first Bayis Rishon, so its kedusha was absolute. It was mamish kadosh, and therefore amei haaretz nichnasin l'sham ve'ochlin sham kachim kalim, and the amei haaretz would go to the marsh area and they would eat kachim kalim because it's part of Yerushalayim. Avalo ma'aser sheni, but interestingly, they would not eat ma'aser sheni there because they were like, they're amei haaretzes, they don't really know stuff, and what they did know though was aser to aser. Aser kadesha tis asher, right? There's that limud of if you separate your maisris, you'll get rich. So they wanted to separate maisris, right? That's the whole thing with amei haaretz, is that the chashudin ala maisris, although we do say rov ma'amei haaretz, ma'aser neim akoponim, these amei haaretz who separated their maisris, they did it so that they can get rich. And when you go and do vidur maisris, one of the things, right, that it says, one of the things that, right, that when you do vidur ma'aser, you say asisik choshatzi visani. I did everything properly, and one of the halachos is ve'achal lefnei Hashem lekecha. You have to eat it before God. So they wanted to be extra stringent, and they wouldn't eat the ma'aser sheni. Even by this lower marsh, they would mamish go into Yerushalayim to eat their ma'aser sheni, so that they could be sure that they're going to be rich. V'chaverim, but the Talmidei Chachamim, who basically knew that this lower marsh is mamish part of Yerushalayim, like any other part of Yerushalayim, and therefore ochlin sham kachim kalim. They would eat kachim kalim there, right? Shlomim, todas, and also ma'aser sheni, as well as ma'aser sheni, because it was part of Yerushalayim. El yoina, the upper marsh, which right shelo oisa kedushasa gemura, which wasn't properly kedushad, so the amei haaretz would treat it the same exact way. Amei haaretz nichnasin shav ochlin sham kachim kalim. They would eat their kachim kalim there. They would say, it's good enough for us. It's part of Yerushalayim. It's Yerushalayim enough for us, even though it's not really true. They were not allowed to eat kachim kalim there, but they said, you know what? Why not? This as far as I'm concerned, this is kachim kalim. This is Yerushalayim, right? And as Rashi says, I think it was maybe difficult for them to find, right? What does Rashi say? Right? If it was too difficult to find an accommodation, inwards in Yerushalayim, they would go to this sort of upper marsh that wasn't actually really part of Yerushalayim, but they would say, it's good enough for us. And they would eat kachim kalim there. But still, aval lo ma'aser sheni, but not ma'aser sheni, because that they wanted to be extra stringent on to make sure that they were really in Yerushalayim, so that they would get rich. V'chaverim, but the Talmidei Chachamim, ein ochlin sham, of course, would not eat in that area, lo kachim kalim, not kachim kalim, v'lo ma'aser sheni, nor ma'aser sheni, because it wasn't actually part of Yerushalayim. And why was it not part of Yerushalayim officially? Shein mosifan al ha'ir v'la'azaris ela b'melech v'novi v'urim v'tumim u'v'sanedjin shel ayin aleph u'v'shtei todas u'v'shir. Because the reason why it wasn't, the upper marsh was not part of Yerushalayim, is because the only way to add on to Yerushalayim is with all of these things, and they didn't have all of these things during Bayis Sheni. V'lama Kichua, why were they makdish it? Lama Kichua, what do you mean now? Ha'amad lo Kichua, we just said they weren't, it wasn't Kadosh. So Ela Lama Ichnisua, but then, what it's asking is, if they weren't able to actually be makdish it because they don't have all these things, so why even bother? Why build the wall around it? Mipnei shetarfa Yerushalayim oisa v'nochi likavesh misham, for security reasons. Because it was vulnerable from that upper marsh, and therefore they built the wall to include the upper marsh as so that Jerusalem would be better protected, but it wasn't actually officially part of Yerushalayim for kachim kalim and ma'aser sheni and things like that. No, so we just had a braise which says that the upper marsh was not part of Yerushalayim because they didn't have all the things. That's a kasha on Rav Nachman, who says you only need one of the things. So you know what? Tanoi, it's taka machloikes Tanoi. It's taka machloikes Tanoi. The Tanan that we learned in the Mishnah, Omar Reb Eliezer says, Reb Eliezer, Shamaiti, I heard, I think he says, what does that say? Shamaiti, me Rabboisai, from my Rebbeim, Kishayubonin beheichol, that when they were building the heichol, that when Ezra and Nehemiah came back to Yerushalayim, they were building right? You had to have construction workers building the heichol in the Beis Hamikdash. And when they were building it, they would put up curtains where the walls would go. Okay, so before they built the walls, they put up curtains where the walls would be. And then, so they made they put up curtains where the walls of the heichal would be, where the walls of the Azara would be. And then what they would do is they would use the curtains as like a guide. Maybe that's not necessarily true. But whatever it is, there were these curtains there, and then when they were building the wall, they would build the wall next to the curtain. Now the thing is, the difference was that by the heichal, they would build the wall outside of the curtains, and when they were building the azaris, they would build the heichal inside of the curtains, right? Kilu, if you're going to be building the wall, around the curtains. So the question is, you're going to build it inside of the curtains or outside of the curtains? So by the heichal, they did it outside of the curtains. By the azaras, they did it inside of the curtains. Rabbi Yoshua says, Rabbi Yoshua Shamaiti, I heard from my Rebbeim, Shemakrivin afapisha in bayis, that you can offer korbanis even when there's no Beis Hamikdash. Ochlin kachei kachim afapisha in kloim, and you can eat kachei kachim even though there's no walls of Jerusalem, even when the temple is destroyed. Even though there's no walls of the Azar. Kachim kalim ma'aser sheni afapisha in choma, and Kachim Kalim and Meister Sheni, even though there's no, right, in Yerushalayim, even though there's no wall. Because, says Rabbi Yoshua, that he heard from his rabbis that Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita Ve Kitchel Lavo, that the Kedusha of Yerushalayim persisted, and therefore you can offer a korban. Even though, what do we say? Even though there's no Beis Hamikdash, you can eat kachei kachim, even though there's no walls in Azar, kachim kalim, even though there's no walls of Jerusalem, because the kedusha is still there. Lav Michlal does not imply that if Rabbi Yoshua is saying kedusha rishona kitchel shaita v'kitchel asilavo, that Rabbi Yehuda in the Reisha, that Rabbi Eliezer from the Reisha suffered lo kitchel asilavo, that Rabbi Eliezer is disagreeing with Rabbi Yoshua and therefore saying that he holds, Rabbi Eliezer holds kedusha rishona kitchel shaita v'loi kitchel asilavo. Ravina says, Ravina to Ravashi, Mimai, why does it necessarily imply that? Yeah, sure, it's clear that Rabbi Yeshua holds Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita V'Kitchel Asulavu. Why does that necessarily mean that Rabbi Eliezer holds differently? Dilma D'Chuli Alma Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita V'Kitchel Asulavu. Maybe both Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer hold that the initial Kedusha persisted. Umar, my deshmir le'komer, my deshmir le'komer. They weren't arguing in this Mishnah. They were simply quoting, right, Shamaiti. They were just quoting what they heard from their Rebbeim. Rabbi Eliezer says, I heard from my Rebbeim about the curtains and how they were building the curtains and the walls around them. And Rabbi Yeshua said, I heard from my Rebbeim about how they could offer korbanos even when there's no Beis Hamikdash, because it could be that Rabbi Eliezer would agree with that as well. He just wasn't talking about that. He was talking about what he heard from his Rebbeim, and that was a different thing. And if you're going to say, then why did Rabbi Eliezer need these curtains? 1 second. Okay. Then why did Rabbi Eliezer need these curtains if they weren't to serve some kind of purpose in like establishing the walls? Right, because Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita have a low Kitchel Asulav, and therefore they had to establish the walls. No, it's just for tzniusa, just so that there would be curtains there while they were building. Okay, fine. Elahani tanoi. Rather, the machloikes is the following. The Tana that we learn in the Brayso, Amar Bishma Rabbi Yossi says, Bishma Rabbi Yossi, Lama Manu Chachomim Es Elu. So this is from Masechta Arochin, that they listed a whole bunch of cities that are considered to have be surrounded with a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. The nafkaminas for Bati Ori, the halachos of Bati Ori Choma. And Amar Bishmal, Rabbi Yossi, Lama Manu Chachom Mesela. How come the Chachom listed these? Sheksha Bnei Agola, that when the exiles returned to Eretz Yisrael, Umatzu Elu, and they found these cities, Vikidshum, and they were makdish these cities. Aval Rishon is Batlu Mishabat La Aretz, but the initial ones, their kedusha went away when the Yidden were exiled. Alma Kasav Kedusha Shona Kitchel L'Shayta V'Lo Kitchel Asalavo. So we see that Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi's opinion is that the initial kedusha went away, and therefore only the cities that were remakadished had their kedusha restored. Uviramini. Amar Bishma Rabbi Yossi v'chi elu bavad hayu. But we have a contradiction. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi says, right? The same Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi says, was it only these cities that were listed? Look for Nemar Shishimir, Kol Chevel Argov, Mamlechas Og Baboshin, Kol Ela Arm Bitsuris, Choma Gavoya. That there's all of these cities, these 60 cities that had walls. Then why list these that were listed? That when the exiles came back to Eretz Yisrael, Matzu Elu Vikidshum. So they found them, they were makdish them. Kidshum, Hashto Aminon, Likaman Delo, Tzriche Lekidusha. I thought we said that, right, that we didn't need to do that. So Ela Matzu Elu Uminaum. No, so rather they found these and they counted them. Not that they had to be makdish them, but they were still at their kedusha, but they counted them. But it's not just these. But as long as you have some kind of a tradition from your fathers, that a particular city was walled from the time of Joshua, so all these mitzvahs of Bati Arichoma would apply in it. Because so we see, interestingly, two opposing opinions of Rabbi Yossi. The first one saying Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita V'Loi Kitchel Asid Lavo, and the other one saying Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita V'Kitsha the Asid Lavo. So we see that it's Taka a Machlaikes. Kash Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi had Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, but isn't Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi contradicting himself? One way to answer it is that there were two different Tanaim quoting the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, and they conflicted. Possibly one of them is Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi. Amr said it to Tanya. Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi Omer Asher Lo Choma Afapisha En Lo Achshav V'Haisa V'Yalo Kodem Lach. It says Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi that even if there's a city that doesn't currently have a wall, but it had a wall prior, it would be considered a walled city. Now, so it could be that he was the author of the second Braise. Continuing from the Mishnah, Nitma Ba'azore V'nel Mamimenu Tuma V'chule. So if a person becomes Tomei in the Azara, so if a Kohen becomes Tomei in the Azara, and then he lapses on the Tuma Ba'azara Minolan, where do we have a pasuk that teaches that becoming Tomei in the Azara is also, you're also going to be chayav for? Right, as Ashi points out, the pasuk says "V'lo yitamu es machneh." If you're already tamei, don't go into the Beis Hamikdash. But I don't know if you're already in the Beis Hamikdash when you become tamei. You're also going to be chayav for that. Rabbi Lazar says Rabbi Lazar, the Amora Rabbi Lazar, because the Echad it says one pasuk as Mishkan Hashem Timei. Well, one pasuk talks about if you're tamei and you go into the Beis Hamikdash, it says as Mishkan Hashem Timei. V'chosav Acher Nemar v'chosav Echad Omer ki as Mikdash Hashem Timei. Another pasuk talks about if you're tamei, you're going to the Beis Hamikdash, and so you're going to be chayiv for being mitamei the Beis Hamikdash. So one pasuk says, so I mean it's the same pasuk twice, just one says Mishkan, one says Mikdash. So we're saying it's basically extra. The second pasuk is unnecessary. If we don't need it to teach about when you're tamei and then go into the Beis Hamikdash, because we already had the first pasuk, right? It's Mishkan Hashem Timei, and as we're going to see later, Mishkan and Mikdash are interchangeable. So why repeat it in another pasuk to teach? So say it's not talking about when you're tamei and then going to the Beis Hamikdash. Let's say it's talking about when you're already in the Beis Hamikdash and become tamei. Where am I? Okay, in the Tumah Shebachutz. Now in the Tumah Shebifnim. Fine. Vikray miyasrei. Wait, is it really true that there's an extra pasuk here? We need both of the pasukim. We need the pasuk that says Mikdash. We need the pasuk that says Mishkan. The Tanya of Belazar Omer says Belazar the Tana. Im nemar Mishkan, lama nemar Mikdash. Im nemar Mikdash, lama nemar Mishkan. Why do we have the same pasuk twice? Just in one place it says Mikdash, the other place it says Mishkan. If in one place it says Mikdash, why do we need it to now have the same pasuk with Mishkan? If in one place it says Mishkan, why do we need the same pasuk with Mikdash? The answer is because ilu nemar Mishkan, v'lo nemar Mikdash. If we only had the pasuk about Mishkan, that if you're tamei and you go into the Mishkan, you're chayiv. But if we didn't have a separate pasuk for Mikdash, I would say, Haisi Omer al Mishkan ye chayiv shari mashuach b'shemen ha-mishcha. I'll say that you're chayiv for going into the Mishkan when you're tamei, because in the Mishkan it was anointed with the anointing oil. Ve al Mikdash lo ye chayiv. But for the Beis Hamikdash, where it wasn't anointed with the anointing oil, then you would not be chayiv. So I needed to say Mikdash. If Mikdash lo nemar Mishkan, and if all it said was Mikdash but not Mishkan, Haisi Omer, I would say al Mikdash ye chayiv. I'll say, okay, fine, you're chayiv if you go into the Beis Hamikdash when you tell me, because Kedushas Kedusha Olam. This is not talking about Kedusha Oshana Kitchel Shad Kitchel Lava. This is talking about, as Rashi says, Heter Bamas. That once there was a Beis Hamikdash, you were no longer allowed to make private altars anymore. Al Mishkan lo ye chayiv, but I would say that going into the Mishkan you would not be chayiv, because there were still certain times you weren't allowed to make. There were certain times when there was an Isser Bamus, when you were not allowed to make private altars, but other times you were allowed to make private altars, even when there was a Mishkan. So maybe I would think that you can go into the Mishkan in a state of, if you go into the Mishkan in a state of Tumah, you'll be pot. L'chachnem or Mishkan, that's why we also need, so l'chachnem or Mishkan, l'chachnem or Mikdash, that's why we need both psukim. We need a pasuk about Mishkan, and we need a pasuk about Mikdash. Interestingly, for the second day in a row, my head's like, not becoming mush, but just becoming like turning off, kind of, in some ways. But I'll be fine. Mikdash, fine. No, so we see that we do need both psukim. We need to teach us Mishkan. We need to teach us Mikdash. We need both psukim. We need to teach it twice. So why is Rabbi Elazar the Amora saying that there's an extra pasuk here, and it's teaching that you're also chayiv if you come tamei inside the Beis Hamikdash? Rabbi Elazar the Amora, hachi kakasha, this is what he was wondering. Michdei Mishkan ikre Mikdash, u Mikdash ikre Mishkan. Look, Mikdash and Mishkan are interchangeable, and therefore nichtov oidi ve'idi Mikdash oidi ve'idi Mishkan. So if that's the case, sure. So if that's the case, you could write the same pasuk twice, sure, but use Mishkan in both of them. Use Mikdash in both of them, and they're interchangeable. I know it's talking about the Mikdash and the Mishkan. One time it's talking about the Mikdash, one time it's talking about the Mikdash. But one time it's talking about the Mishkan, one time it's talking about the Mikdash. Why do I need it to switch it up, and in one pasuk say Mikdash, and the other one say Mishkan? Where am I? Mikdash or Mishkan? Mishkan or Mikdash lamali. Why do I need to say both? Shmamina Taita, it's teaching us both things. It's teaching us that going into the Mikdash as well as going into the Mishkan when you're Tamei, you'll be chayav for it. And it's also teaching that if you become, the same applies if you become Tamei in the Beis Hamikdash. Woo. Bishlama Mikdash, Ikre Mishkan. Okay, I understand. Right, we said that the Beis Hamikdash is called the Mishkan. Tichsiv, the Pasuk says, "V'nasati Mishkani b'sochachem." I'll put my Mishkan inside of you. And that's a reference to the Beis Hamikdash. Ela Mishkan de Ikre Mikdash Minal. And how do you know that the Mishkan is called the Mikdash? Ilim midichsiv v'nasu hakasim no say Mikdash. How about Aaron Ksiv? If it says that the Bnei Kas would travel in the desert And they would carry the mikdash. That's talking about the aron. It's not talking about the base. It's not calling the mishkan the mikdash. Ella mehacha from here v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'sochem, built from a mikdash. Uchsiv k'chol sheyani ma'ir also is tabnis a mishkan. And also we're talking about the mishkan. So we see that the mishkan is called the mikdash. V'shtachavo sheshar kidei shtachavayis. So we said that if somebody goes into the if he becomes tummy in the azara, and then after becoming tummy and lapsing, he bows down or waits enough time to bow down, so then he'll be chayiv to bring a korban olav yard when he realizes. Rava says when we say that bowing down is enough, that is when he bows down westwardly towards the Kodesh HaKodashim. But if he bows down eastwardly, away from the Kodesh HaKodashim, well then, bowing down is not enough for him to be chayiv. Shah in lo shah lo. If he waited enough time, so then he'll be chayiv. But if he didn't wait enough time, then it will be patur. Those who teach on the seifa about waiting enough time, or that he waited in the azara enough time to bow down. Which means that bowing down alone is not enough for you to be chayiv. You'd have to, make sure that you're bowing down for long enough. Rava says Rava, but says Rava, when we say that you have to wait a certain amount of time, that's only if you're bowing away from the Kodesh HaKodashim. But towards the Kodesh HaKodashim, even right then, just bowing would be enough, even if he doesn't wait enough time. And this is what the Mishnah is saying. If he bows towards the Kodesh HaKodashim, or the klape chutz, or if he bows in a different direction, but he waits enough time, chayiv, it would be chayiv to bring a korban. Right, we're talking about bowing down, but also enough time to bow down. Aren't those basically the same amount of time? So it sounds like there's basically one kind of way to bow down that isn't enough time, and one way to bow down that is enough time. Delays b'shehiyah, when we say bowing down that isn't enough time, so kriya ba'amo, that's just kneeling. This b'shehiyah, bowing down that is sort of enough time, pishut yodayim v'raglayim, that is going down and extending your hands and your legs. V'chamer shir shehiyah, and how long is this amount of time that it takes to wait? Pligi b'atz machlokes Reb Yitzchak bar Nachmani v'chad imei umanu Reb Shimon ben Pazi. Alternatively, Reb Shimon ben Pazi v'chad imei umanu Reb Yitzchak bar Nachmani. Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani. Okay. One says the amount of time to wait is the amount of time that it takes to say the following pasuk. The other opinion is that it's only from the words in the following pasuk of Vayichru and on. So either it's this entire pasuk that we're about to read, or just from the word Vayichru and on. Here's the pasuk. And now it says Vayichru apayim arza ala ritzba vayishtachu v'hodos la'Hashem kitov kilam chazo. So one opinion is that it's the whole pasuk. The other opinion is only from Vayichru and on. Tanu Rabbanan kida al apayim, that if it says kida, it's talking about on your face. V'cheinu vatikod b'sheva apayim. Or it's kriya al berkayim, kriya is on your knees. V'cheinu omer mikroa al birkov. Hishtachavoya zo pishu tadayim v'raglayim. Hishtachavoya is extending your hands and your legs. V'chein omer hovinove ani ve'imcha ve'achecha hishtachvos techa arza. So hishtachavoya is arza, is like you're extending your hands and your legs and opening up on the ground. Alright, wow. Whew, that was exhausting for some reason. I don't know why it was such an exhausting daf. But the first Amr we talked about very interesting things. Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaitav Kitchel Asid and different implications about Yerushalayim, the Kedusha of Yerushalayim. That was interesting. And then we talked about becoming Tameh in the Azar Pisa.